Hello and welcome. My name is Ed Lima, and this is GraphQL meets SQL, Modern Data Access for SQL Developers in Microsoft Fabric. Very excited to be here. I hope you're having a great day so far, and let's get started. First of all, a little bit about myself. I don't know if technologist is still a good word, but I'm very passionate about technology. I've been working with technology for many years, with lots of experience in application development, data, product management, and also cloud. Been working cloud for a very long time. Currently, I'm a principal product manager at Microsoft Fabric, working specifically on Fabric API for GraphQL. And today we're going to talk about exactly that, GraphQL. What is GraphQL, right? Of course, here, this is a SQL conference. We are all familiar with SQL, which is a great technology. But how GraphQL can empower SQL applications and actually help to expose data to a wider audience through different kinds of applications. We're also going to talk about what's offered in Fabric and how we make super easy to use GraphQL and SQL together in Fabric. We end up with a little demo, and you see how we can basically set up a GraphQL API to expose SQL data to your application in about less than 5 minutes. Let's get started. So GraphQL is an API query language and a runtime to fulfill those queries. You describe your data using a schema with types and specific fields. Client applications or API clients can just request what they need and allows you to get predictable results using a very simple and flexible language. So, of course, one of the biggest selling points is applications request the data they need, right? It's a strongly typed system where a schema defines the data. And again, that logic comes out of the box if you need strongly typed code in your application. You have GraphQL expose a single endpoint, no need for paths or anything like that. And you access the data through that single endpoint, and you can get data from multiple data sources, again, sometimes using a single API call. And you can aggregate data from again, multiple sources through that single API response. So GraphQL API is defined in the GraphQL schema, which is a schema definition language where the main components are types, and types has multiple fields. You can draw a parallel with databases where types you can relate to a table, and the fields will be the columns of that table. There are specific operations in GraphQL, queries to read data, mutations to write data. And in your schema, you can also define relationships between the types that you have. A quick comparison here on GraphQL and SQL. So as I mentioned before, GraphQL is a query language for APIs and a runtime to fulfill those queries with the existing data. So it's very much on the front end side of things where you want to expose data. Can be on the back end side of things if you have a back end API. It's totally fine to use that as well. So SQL is a query language for relational databases. It's again the use is more focused on specifically on the database side. GraphQL is best used for fetching data from APIs efficiently, and SQL used for managing and querying structured data in databases. Data retrieval in GraphQL is very simple. We just need a GraphQL client, and the clients basically define the data that they need. In SQL, you use predefined queries to retrieve data like selects, joins, inserts. so on and so forth. GraphQL is very flexible, allowing multiple data sources to provide data in a single request. You don't have to make multiple API calls. So it makes it very efficient in that way. You can get more data with less API calls. SQL, it's more rigid, of course, and you have to define your data also in a schema and define the relationships with keys and primary keys, foreign keys, and things like that. GraphQL is technology agnostic. We can, while our focus here is on SQL as a backend, GraphQL supports anything. It can be SQL, NoSQL, REST APIs as a backend. So it abstracts all the backend technology from the API client side of things. SQL is more focused on relational databases. GraphQL, as I mentioned, very efficient. You get the data that you need, no overfetching, no underfetching. And SQL, of course, you can optimize your database with indexing, caching, store procedures. Both of them, as already mentioned, they use a schema. They are strongly typed systems. Learning curve, so GraphQL is very familiar with API and front-end developers. And SQL, of course, you need some knowledge of relational algebra, SQL syntax, relational databases, and things like that. So it's much more data-centric, database-centric backend use case. That's not to say that GraphQL cannot be used on the backend. It can, of course. So use cases for GraphQL, it can be used for front-end applications, for back-end APIs, microservices, and basically consolidate data from multiple data sources. SQL, widely used for data storage, business intelligence, reporting, transactional apps. So let's get started, again, drawing some comparisons and parallels between SQL and GraphQL. And you see they're actually pretty similar. Of course, again, here we are all very familiar with SQL. It's a SQL conference, but you might not be that familiar with GraphQL. Querying data with SQL, of course, you use a select statement. There is that concept of select star, where you get all the data. In GraphQL, there's no such concept. You have to specifically define the data you need. And that's on purpose because, again, we are telling the API clients, you tell me what you need, and I'm just going to provide that. If you don't need specific data about currency or capital, then I'm not going to send that to you. But again, as you can see, very simple syntax. You just need to define type or multiple types and the fields that you want to get data from. So GraphQL query, the main thing, of course, it's very heavily based on JSON. You define operation, right? Query to reads, mutations to writes, and then you just need to provide a specific type. You can draw a comparison again. The type could be a table in your SQL database, and you have a selection set. The selection set is the fields that you want to retrieve, and that would be the column selection from the database. In a single query, you can basically request data from multiple types, and you see in our demo also you can create relationships between those types very easily, and basically consolidate the data even more. Filtering data. So how you can basically just tell that runtime or that backend just specific data that you need, right? That's the bread and butter of GraphQL. And of course, with SQL, also you can do that. You use a where clause or you define a specific filter of data based on conditions. GraphQL, very similar. basically you can define filters, or you can use arguments to define what you want. You can also select add multiple arguments. You can have and or logic as well, and use comparisons on your filter and your arguments as well. For instance, here just retrieving whatever code language it's in English. Inserting and updating data. In SQL, again, we all know the insert statement, delete and update. Basically, you cover all the CRUD use cases here: create, read, update, delete, list. We talked about querying before, but here's basically how you're writing data, right? In GraphQL, of course, in SQL, you have multiple operations, but in GraphQL, there's only two. Queries to read data, mutations to write data. And GraphQL mutations are very similar because you just provide arguments, right? And those arguments in your mutation code, you just need to provide the value of the data that you want to insert or update. Usually, as best practices in the GraphQL schema, you define a specific mutation to create, a specific mutation to list, a specific query to list, a specific query to read, and a specific mutation to insert, delete, or update. So you can have different logic depending on the operation you want to use. I think now you're all experts in GraphQL. Again, it's a very simple and powerful API technology. However, if you want to implement your own GraphQL backend, your own GraphQL server, there are lots of things you need to worry about. And it can take from weeks to months to have GraphQL API in production. Of course, you have to define your server, configure the server, define the schema, configure the resolvers. So resolvers are built-in functions in GraphQL that resolve the data from your schema, from your types or queries or mutations fields with the data from the data source. Right, so there are specific functions to access the data source and provide the data that you need. So you need to actually code all those resolvers manually as well and add your specific logic there. After this is all done, you have to think about performance, monitoring, tuning, and also securing your API with authorization authentication layers. So again, lots of work to do. And how are we solving this problem in Fabric? Well, we're basically taking care of all of that for you with API for GraphQL. So we take care of schema generation, resolvers generation, security, and monitoring, and all of that for you. So basically, you take advantage of all the Fabric goodness. So API for GraphQL is Fabric native with security, governance, capacity consumption model following all the other Fabric workloads. Provides a very simple, flexible, SaaSified experience with a single intelligent endpoint for all the data of your application. So it's basically API for GraphQL is the data API for Fabric. And again, taking another look at how GraphQL in general works and how specifically API for GraphQL and Fabric works. So API clients, basically, they're authorized. So there is no public API for GraphQL. You have to provide some sort of authorization to access your data, authorization authentication. So the GraphQL API receives an authorized request and then automatically sends that request depending on the data that's requested to the different data sources. And then it consolidates all the responses from different data sources in a single JSON payload that's then sent back to the API client. So it allows to basically get more data with a single API call. If you compare to other API technologies, you have a separate API for each one of the data sources you have to make 4 or more API calls to retrieve the same amount of data. In GraphQL, single API call. And of course, it abstracts all the backend complexity here, right? You don't write any SQL code in your application client. And of course, it protects your data against things like SQL injections and things like that. So it's very recommended to use an API as a layer of security, and don't actually run SQL statements in your client application. So GraphQL is here to help basically provide that sort of capability to protect your SQL data and expose the SQL data to applications. So once you set up your API for GraphQL in Fabric, exposing your data, you prototype your queries, you know what you want to expose. All you need to do is very simple. You just need to click a button in our portal, copy the API endpoint. Then you need to go to Microsoft Entra and basically create an app registration. You provide the endpoint, some specific information about the client ID, the authority where you're authenticating your Enter application, and the GraphQL endpoint, and you're good to go. So you can basically start querying and exposing your data to the application. It's very simple and very easy. What about security? So how we actually securing the data and blocking unauthorized access. So here we have client applications that they can be internal applications, external applications, web, mobile, line of business, anything that you need, right? Maybe you're developing a dashboard and you can expose that using GraphQL. You have your API for GraphQL endpoint in Fabric, and you want to expose Fabric data, right? Of course, the most simple use case is you have a user in Fabric, right? As I mentioned, we authorize the access of the user with Entra, registering an application in Entra. So that user can then use single sign-on to access your Fabric data. That means that your database user or data warehouse or lakehouse user is also an API user, right? And that's fine for specific internal applications. That might be some of the requirements, right? So you can provide that sort of facility to access your data. But sometimes maybe you don't want you have an external application and your user is not in Fabric or not in Active Directory. So you can use service principal. So you can basically have a service principal, a service, of course, a backend service that can provide access to your API, and you add some specific logic to authorize specific users that can be on any other identity provider that you use in your business. So that's very a common use case for external applications, can be mobile web applications. And you can add the service principal as a database or data source user. So it could use also the same pass-through capability, SSO capability. Or if you don't want your user of the API user to be a database user, you can use a save credential that is basically shared by all the connections. So it allows for better scalability. And depending on the use case, again, you don't want your database users to be your application users. That's perfectly fine. So that way we allow to basically protect your data and address different requirements and different use cases to expose your Fabric data. And we also have a new member in the Fabric family. It was announced in public preview very recently in November. We have now a Fabric native SQL database where you basically, it's built on the foundation of Azure SQL that everyone knows and love, provides a very simple, powerful, flexible, performant experience. Again, in the ethos of Fabric, you want to simplify the experience, provide a SaaS experience. It's integrated with all the Fabric goodness and Fabric components. It can be deployed in seconds. It's very fast, auto scale and performance. It's basically optimized. And basically, like I mentioned, integrate the Fabric services, OneLake integrated. So it's a great database, a great option to store your data in Fabric. So now, how you bring those things together? So how can you expose your SQL data application through a GraphQL API in Fabric in about 5 minutes? Well, let's take a look and see how you can do it. So we have here a SQL database already created, the Fabric SQL database already created in my workspace. I can access that. I just basically use sample data that's readily available when you create a database for the first time. You have your data about customers, sales, products. It's a very simple database. All you need to do is click a button in the ribbon and provide a name for your API. You provide a name and you click create. After doing that, all you need to do is select the tables you want to expose, right? I just want to expose that sales LT, the sales IT tables there. And that's pretty much it. You click load, GraphQL schema is automatically generated for you, all the resolvers, queries, mutations, and you're ready to query your data. Just like that. We have API editor and explorer where you can basically test and prototype your queries and understand how you want the queries to be presented in an application. We have full IntelliSense where you can easily just autocomplete the fields that you want to provide. So it's very easy to get started. See, here, we just want to query the customers table with specific columns, customer ID, phone, modified date. And there you go. You have your JSON data returned there. You can also create relationships between your data. So we have here the sales order header type. And the header can have many orders. So you're going to create a relationship, a one-to-many relationship between sales orders header and sales order detail, using sales order ID as the key, right, to create that relationship. Again, to create the relationship, the schema is refreshed automatically, and a new field is created under the type we selected. You can see there sales order detail is now created in the in the type. And let's now query sales orders and query the details of those orders, right? So again, the sales order header can have multiple order details. So we specify here specific fields, and they're going to go also include the specific quantity of an order and maybe a unit price there. Just need to run our query, and there you go. Very quickly, very performantly, we have basically the data, the sales order header, and all the order details with those specific fields that we specified. You can then test very, very easily. You generate code in Node.js or Python. We generate that code for you, and you just need to copy that. I have VS Code running locally. I'm just going to paste that code. And here I already have a Node.js project with the dependencies installed, just Azure Identity. It uses an interactive login. Basically, it's going to use my credentials and a browser to confirm my identity. Of course, I have access to that workspace. And after I am authenticated, it just returns the data there. You can see all that data returned by my Node.js local application. Of course, in the production, you wouldn't use an iterative authentication like that using the browser. You want to use Entra application registration, but that's a very quick and easy way to test locally using Node.js and Python. But there it goes, less than 5 minutes. You have your data in SQL and the Fabric SQL. You can expose to an API for GraphQL in a very secure, safe way, very performant way, and get the data available to your users and customers for line of business applications, for external web or mobile applications, and in whatever way you need to expose the data. Here's some resources for you to get started. We have a very great tutorial available where you can get started. It also uses Fabric SQL on the back end. You can go step by step, explore more the options that you can have with GraphQL and SQL and Fabric. We also have our documentation, and we recently announced general availability of API for GraphQL with exciting new features such as deployment pipeline, Git integration support, monitoring dashboard with request logging, and many more. Also support for Azure SQL directly if you don't want to use Fabric SQL. So yeah, take a look. I hope you enjoy, and I hope those resources are useful for you in your next project. Also, there's a new learning path. Take a look, develop data-driven applications using Microsoft Azure SQL database. Well, that's it from me. I hope that was useful. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope you have a great rest of the conference with many other exciting sessions out there.